Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about how a single arrest brought America's atomic secrets into the Cold War. On the morning of June 15, 1950, at approximately 7:30 a.m., FBI special agents knocked on the door of an apartment at 10 Monroe Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side. The building was a typical walk-up in the Knickerbocker Village housing complex, home to working-class families, many of them Jewish immigrants or their children who had settled in New York during the early decades of the 20th century. The weather that morning was already warm, with summer humidity settling over the city. The agents carried arrest warrants issued by the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. The man they had come to arrest was Julius Rosenberg, a 32-year-old electrical engineer who had been suspended from his government job with the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1945 under suspicion of Communist Party membership. Julius lived in the Monroe Street apartment with his wife Ethel, who was 34 years old, and their two young sons, Michael, who was 7, and Robert, who was 3. According to neighbors who were later interviewed by investigators and journalists, the Rosenbergs appeared to be an unremarkable family. Julius worked as an engineer for small manufacturing companies. Ethel stayed home with the children, and the family lived frugally on a modest income. They were known in the building as quiet, polite, and devoted to their sons. When the agents knocked, Ethel Rosenberg answered the door. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with dark curly hair and a somewhat serious demeanor. According to FBI reports, she appeared surprised to see agents at her door at such an early hour. She called her husband to the entrance. Julius, who was slightly taller than his wife, with thinning dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses, came to the door wearing a white undershirt and trousers. He had not yet dressed for work. The lead agent informed Julius Rosenberg that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. According to the arrest report, Julius asked what the charges concerned. When informed that they related to passing classified information to the Soviet Union, Julius denied any knowledge of such activities. He asked to see the arrest warrant, which the agents provided. Julius read the document carefully while Ethel stood beside him. The two young boys, awakened by the commotion, appeared in the hallway behind their parents. Michael, who was old enough to understand that something was wrong, asked his mother what was happening. Ethel told him that everything would be all right and asked him to take his younger brother back to their bedroom. Julius Rosenberg was allowed to change into proper clothing. Ethel asked the agents where they were taking her husband and when he would be allowed to come home. According to witnesses present, she was informed that Julius would be taken to FBI headquarters for processing and that the matter would be handled by the courts. Ethel appeared shaken, but maintained her composure in front of her children. Julius was escorted from the apartment at approximately 7:50 a.m. He was not handcuffed at that point, as was standard procedure for arrests in residential buildings where the suspect was cooperative. Ethel stood in the doorway with Michael beside her, watching as her husband was taken down the stairs. The arrest of Julius Rosenberg represented the culmination of an FBI investigation that had begun nearly a year earlier. The investigation had started with the confession in England of physicist Klaus Fuchs, who admitted passing Manhattan Project secrets to Soviet intelligence. Fuchs's cooperation led American investigators to Harry Gold, a chemist serving as a courier for Soviet intelligence. Gold's interrogation led to David Greenglass, a former Army machinist who had worked at Los Alamos. And Greenglass, when faced with evidence of his own espionage, told investigators that the person who had recruited him was his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg had been born in May 1918 to a family of Jewish immigrants on New York's Lower East Side. According to later interviews with family members and records from the period, his father, Harry Rosenberg, worked as a garment presser in the city's textile factories. His mother, Sophie, raised Julius and his 4 siblings in a crowded tenement apartment. School records and interviews with former classmates indicate that Julius had been an academically gifted child with particular aptitude for mathematics and science. He graduated from Seward Park High School in 1934 and attended City College of New York on partial scholarship, studying electrical engineering. City College during the 1930s was a hotbed of political activism. The economic devastation of the Depression, combined with the rise of fascism in Europe, had radicalized many young people, particularly those from working-class immigrant backgrounds. According to later testimony and FBI records, Julius joined the Young Communist League sometime in 1935 or 1936 during his sophomore year. For many young Jewish students at City College, communism represented not just a political ideology, but a response to what they perceived as the failures of capitalism and the growing threat of Nazi Germany to Jews in Europe. It was through his involvement in the Young Communist League that Julius met Ethel Greenglass. Ethel had been born in September 1915, also to a family of Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side. According to family accounts, her father, Barnett Greenglass, worked as a sewing machine repairman. Her mother, Tessie, worked part-time in the garment industry. Ethel had shown early talent as a singer and had aspired to a career in music. But financial constraints had forced her to leave high school before graduation and take work as a clerk typist at a shipping company. She had joined the Young Communist League in the mid-1930s and had become involved in labor organizing efforts. Julius and Ethel met at a Young Communist League meeting in 1936 and began a courtship. According to friends who knew them during this period, they shared a deep commitment to communist ideology and to what they believed was the struggle against fascism and economic inequality. They married in June 1939, shortly after Julius graduated from City College with his engineering degree. In 1940, Julius obtained a position as a civilian junior engineer with the U.S. Army Signal Corps, assigned to work at the Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. According to employment records, the position required a background investigation, but not a high-level security clearance, as Julius's initial work involved routine engineering tasks related to military communications equipment. His salary, though modest, was sufficient to support himself and Ethel. Their first son, Michael, was born in March 1943, and their second son, Robert, was born in May 1947. It was during the period from approximately 1942 to 1945 that, according to later testimony and declassified Soviet intelligence documents, Julius Rosenberg became actively involved in Soviet espionage. The exact circumstances of his recruitment have never been fully documented in publicly available records, but FBI investigators and historians who have studied declassified materials from both American and Soviet archives have pieced together a general outline. Julius appears to have been approached by a Soviet intelligence officer or talent spotter who recognized both his commitment to communist ideology and his access to potentially useful technical information through his Signal Corps work. The approach was likely made through Communist Party channels, as Soviet intelligence services relied heavily on the Communist Party USA to identify potential recruits. According to declassified Soviet intelligence documents and later analysis by U.S. intelligence agencies, Julius's initial espionage activities focused on collecting information related to military electronics and radar systems. He had access through his signal corps position to technical specifications and research reports that, while not related to atomic weapons, were nonetheless classified and valuable to Soviet military planners seeking to understand and counter American technological capabilities. Julius provided this information to Soviet handlers through a series of meetings in New York City, using code names and employing basic tradecraft techniques to avoid detection. By 1944, as the Manhattan Project, the top-secret American effort to develop an atomic bomb, accelerated toward completion, Soviet intelligence became increasingly focused on penetrating the project and obtaining information about atomic weapons design and production. Julius Rosenberg, while not having direct access to the Manhattan Project himself, was in a position to recruit others who did. The most significant of these recruits was David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's younger brother. David Greenglass had been born in 1922, 7 years after Ethel, into the same working-class Jewish family on the Lower East Side. According to his own later testimony, he had worked as a machinist and had joined the U.S. Army in 1943. In 1944, he was assigned to Los Alamos, New Mexico, as part of the Special Engineer Detachment, a unit of enlisted soldiers with technical skills who were assigned to support the work of the scientists and engineers at the Manhattan Project's main laboratory. Greenglass's specific job was as a machinist in the facility's workshops, where components for the atomic bomb were fabricated and tested. While his security clearance was relatively low and his access was limited compared to senior scientists, he was nonetheless exposed to classified technical information about the bomb's design, particularly the implosion mechanism that would be used in the plutonium bomb. According to David Greenglass's later testimony at trial, Julius Rosenberg recruited him into espionage during a furlough visit to New York in late 1944 or early 1945. Greenglass testified that Julius had approached him with an appeal to help the Soviet Union, which at that time was still an American ally in the war against Nazi Germany. Julius reportedly argued that sharing atomic weapons information with the Soviets would help ensure post-war peace by preventing any one nation from having a monopoly on such devastating weapons. Greenglass, who had communist sympathies influenced by his sister and brother-in-law, agreed to provide information. The information Greenglass provided was transmitted through a courier network. According to trial testimony and FBI investigation records, Greenglass prepared written descriptions and rough sketches of technical components he had worked on at Los Alamos. These materials were passed to couriers who met with Greenglass during visits to Albuquerque, New Mexico, or during his furlough trips to New York. The couriers included Harry Gold, who was later arrested and testified about his role. Gold described meeting Greenglass in Albuquerque in June 1945, receiving a package of documents and sketches, and delivering them to his Soviet handler in New York. Julius Rosenberg's role, according to the evidence presented at trial and in declassified documents, was as an organizer and coordinator. He maintained contact with multiple individuals who had access to classified information, he arranged meetings and transfers, he provided guidance on what information to collect, and he served as a conduit between these sources and Soviet intelligence handlers. In essence, he operated a small espionage network, what intelligence professionals would call a spy ring, focused on collecting scientific and technical information. In September 1945, shortly after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just weeks after the end of World War II, Julius Rosenberg was suspended from his Signal Corps position. According to employment records, the suspension was based on information that had come to the attention of Army security officials indicating that Julius had been a member of the Communist Party. At that time, membership in the Communist Party was not illegal, but it was grounds for denial or revocation of employment in sensitive government positions. Julius was given the opportunity to respond to the allegations. According to employment records, he denied Communist Party membership, but the Army's Security Review concluded that the evidence supported the allegation and his employment was terminated. The loss of his government position meant that Julius needed to find other employment. Over the next several years, he worked for small manufacturing companies and attempted to start his own business, a machine shop. The business struggled financially, and the Rosenberg family's economic situation became increasingly precarious. By 1950, when Julius was arrested, the family was living largely on Ethel's modest earnings from occasional clerical work and on loans from Ethel's mother. What Julius and Ethel Rosenberg apparently did not know was that American and British intelligence had, since 1946, been conducting a secret program to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications. The program, codenamed Venona, involved analyzing encrypted Soviet cables that had been intercepted during and after World War II. The decryption was extraordinarily difficult and took years, but by the late 1940s, American cryptanalysts had succeeded in partially decrypting thousands of messages. These messages revealed the existence of extensive Soviet espionage operations in the United States, including operations targeting the Manhattan Project. One of the code names that appeared repeatedly in the decrypted Venona messages was Liberal, which American counterintelligence analysts eventually identified as likely referring to Julius Rosenberg. Other code names in the messages corresponded to individuals in Rosenberg's network, including David Greenglass. The Venona material provided crucial intelligence that guided FBI investigations, though the existence of Venona was so highly classified that it could not be used directly as evidence in court. Instead, the FBI used the Venona leads to identify suspects and then built cases against them using conventional investigative methods and testimony from cooperating witnesses. When Julius Rosenberg was arrested that June morning, the FBI already had substantial evidence against him, including Greenglass's testimony, Gold's testimony, and corroborating details from the Venona decrypts. What the FBI did not have at the time of Julius's arrest was strong evidence that would directly implicate Ethel Rosenberg as an active participant in the conspiracy. Ethel's role would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. According to David Greenglass's initial statements to the FBI, Ethel had been aware of the espionage activities but had not been actively involved. However, as the investigation progressed and as prosecutors sought to build pressure on Julius to cooperate, the government's strategy shifted. By late July 1950, approximately 6 weeks after Julius's arrest, prosecutors and FBI officials made the decision to arrest Ethel as well, partly based on Greenglass's revised testimony and partly as a tactical move designed to compel Julius to confess in order to spare his wife. On the morning of August 11, 1950, FBI agents returned to the Monroe Street apartment. This time they came to arrest Ethel Rosenberg. The children, Michael, now 7, and Robert, now 3, were home when their mother was taken away. According to accounts from family members and neighbors who witnessed the arrest, Ethel was calm and composed, instructing her sons to be good and telling them that she would return soon. The children were taken to stay with Ethel's mother, Tessie Greenglass. Though those arrangements would prove to be temporary and fraught with difficulty, The arrest of both parents left Michael and Robert Rosenberg in an extraordinarily difficult position. They were young children who could not fully understand why their parents had been taken away. The extended family was divided by the case. Ethel's brother David had testified against Julius and Ethel, creating a bitter rift within the Greenglass family. Tessie Greenglass, Ethel's mother, was torn between loyalty to her daughter and her son, and the strain of caring for two young children under such circumstances proved overwhelming. Eventually, Michael and Robert were placed with other family members and friends while their parents remained in custody. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were held in detention pending trial. Both maintained their innocence. Julius, when questioned by the FBI and during subsequent grand jury proceedings, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to answer questions about Communist Party membership or about any espionage activities. Ethel did the same. Their refusal to cooperate convinced prosecutors that the couple would not confess or provide information about others in their network, and the government proceeded toward trial. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg began on March 6, 1951, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, with Judge Irving R. Kaufman presiding. The trial took place in the context of heightened Cold War tensions. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, far earlier than American officials had expected, and the Korean War had begun in June 1950. Public fear of communist infiltration and Soviet espionage was intense, fueled by investigations conducted by the House Un-American Activities Committee and by Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist campaign. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Irving Sapol, presented a case built largely on the testimony of confessed participants in the espionage conspiracy. The key witness was David Greenglass, who testified in detail about his work at Los Alamos, the information he had provided to Soviet agents, and Julius Rosenberg's role in recruiting him and coordinating the collection of information. Crucially, Greenglass testified that Ethel had typed up handwritten notes containing classified information, a claim that would later be recanted, but which at trial provided the primary evidence of Ethel's active participation in the conspiracy. Harry Gold, the courier who had received information from both Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass, also testified, describing his meetings with Greenglass and his role in the broader espionage network. Other witnesses testified about meetings and activities that connected the Rosenbergs to Soviet intelligence operations. The defense, led by Emanuel Bloch, attempted to challenge the credibility of the government's witnesses, particularly Greenglass, by suggesting that he was testifying against his sister and brother-in-law to save himself and his wife. Ruth Greenglass, David's wife, had also been implicated, but was not indicted, likely because she agreed to cooperate. The defense argued that the evidence against the Rosenbergs was circumstantial and uncorroborated, that the testimony came from admitted criminals seeking leniency, and that Julius and Ethel were being persecuted for their political beliefs rather than for any actual crimes. Julius and Ethel both testified in their own defense. Both denied any involvement in espionage. Julius testified that he had never been a member of the Communist Party, though he acknowledged sympathy for progressive causes. Ethel testified that she had no knowledge of any espionage activities and had never typed any documents related to classified information. Both invoked their Fifth Amendment rights when asked certain questions about Communist Party associations, a decision that likely damaged their credibility with the jury. The trial lasted less than 3 weeks. On March 29, 1951, after deliberating for less than a full day, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Morton Sobel, an engineer and former classmate of Julius's at City College, who was accused of participating in the espionage network, was also convicted and received a 30-year sentence. The question then became what sentence Judge Kaufman would impose on the Rosenbergs. On April 5, 1951, Judge Kaufman sentenced both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. In his sentencing statement, Kaufman described their crime as worse than murder because, he argued, the atomic secrets they had provided to the Soviet Union had contributed to Soviet acquisition of nuclear weapons, which in turn had emboldened communist aggression in Korea and had put American lives at risk. He stated that their crime had changed the course of history and that the nature of the offense warranted the ultimate penalty. The death sentences imposed on the Rosenbergs sparked immediate controversy. Supporters of the Rosenbergs organized protests and legal appeals, arguing that the sentences were disproportionate to the offense, that the trial had been unfair, that the evidence had been insufficient, and that the couple was being executed for their political beliefs rather than for espionage. Critics noted that other individuals convicted of espionage, including Klaus Fuchs, who received 14 years in British prison, and David Greenglass, who received 15 years, had not been sentenced to death, and they argued that the Rosenberg sentences reflected anti-communist hysteria and, some suggested, anti-Semitism. The legal appeals process continued for more than 2 years. The Rosenbergs' attorneys filed multiple appeals to higher courts, arguing various constitutional and procedural grounds for overturning the convictions or reducing the sentences. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to overturn the convictions. Clemency petitions were filed with President Harry Truman in late 1952 and with President Dwight Eisenhower after he took office in January 1953. Both presidents declined to grant clemency. Eisenhower, in a statement explaining his decision, wrote that he could find no grounds for mercy, given what he described as the couple's continuing refusal to cooperate or to demonstrate remorse. Throughout this period, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg remained in custody, held in separate cells at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. They were allowed limited visits with each other and with their attorneys. They corresponded regularly by letter, and these letters, which were later published, revealed two people struggling to maintain hope, expressing love for each other and for their children, and insisting on their innocence. Michael and Robert Rosenberg, meanwhile, spent these years moving between temporary homes. The difficulties of the situation were compounded by the notoriety of the case. Few people were willing or able to care for the children of the most famous accused spies in America. According to later interviews, the boys visited their parents in prison on a few occasions, supervised visits that were brief and difficult for everyone involved. Michael, who was 9 years old by the time of the executions, had some understanding of what was happening, though the full implications were beyond his grasp. Robert, who was only 6, understood even less. Both children were traumatized by the separations, the instability, and the awareness that something terrible was happening to their family. As the execution date approached in June 1953, the campaign to save the Rosenbergs intensified. Demonstrations were held in the United States and in cities around the world. Prominent intellectuals, religious leaders, and political figures appealed for clemency. Pope Pius XII sent a plea to President Eisenhower asking for mercy. The case had become an international cause célèbre, with many viewing the Rosenbergs as martyrs to McCarthyism and Cold War paranoia, while others saw them as dangerous traitors who deserved their fate. The execution was scheduled for the evening of June 19, 1953. Under Jewish law, executions were not to be carried out on the Sabbath, which begins at sundown on Friday. The Rosenbergs' attorneys filed emergency motions arguing that executing them on Friday evening would violate their religious rights. Judge Kaufman, in response, moved the execution time earlier in the day to before sundown to avoid any conflict with the Sabbath. At approximately 8 p.m. on June 19, 1953, Julius Rosenberg was taken to the execution chamber at Sing Sing Prison. According to the official execution log, he was pronounced dead at 8:06 p.m., following the administration of electrical current. His body was removed from the chamber, and Ethel Rosenberg was brought in. Ethel was strapped into the electric chair at 8:11 p.m. Eyewitnesses to the execution, including reporters and official observers, later reported that the first series of electrical charges did not kill Ethel, and that she appeared to still be alive when the electricity was stopped. Additional charges were administered. According to some accounts, multiple applications of electrical current were required before Ethel was finally pronounced dead at 8:16 p.m. The details of Ethel's execution were particularly disturbing to those who witnessed it and added to the controversy surrounding the case. Michael and Robert Rosenberg were not told immediately about their parents' executions. They learned the news the following day from the couple who had been caring for them. Michael, who was 10 years old, later described the moment in interviews and in a memoir he co-authored with his brother. He remembered feeling numb, unable to process what he was being told, unable to believe that his parents were actually dead. Robert, who was 7, understood less clearly, but recognized that something final and terrible had happened. In the months and years following the executions, Michael and Robert were eventually adopted by Abel and Anne Meeropol, a couple who had been active in progressive political circles and who had followed the Rosenberg case with sympathy for the condemned couple. Abel Meeropol was a songwriter and teacher. He had written the song "Strange Fruit," famously performed by Billie Holiday, and he and his wife offered to adopt the Rosenberg children when it became clear that no one else was willing or able to provide them with a stable home. The boys took the Meeropol surname and were raised in relative privacy, shielded as much as possible from the notoriety of their parents' case. The question of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's guilt has been debated for more than 70 years. For decades after their executions, supporters maintained that the couple had been innocent victims of Cold War hysteria, framed by a government desperate to find scapegoats for Soviet atomic espionage. The Rosenbergs themselves had maintained their innocence to the end, and the case became a rallying point for those who opposed McCarthyism and who believed that the U.S. government had violated civil liberties in its pursuit of suspected communists. However, the release of declassified documents beginning in the 1990s substantially changed the historical understanding of the case. The Venona decrypts, which were made public in 1995, provided strong evidence that Julius Rosenberg had indeed been involved in Soviet espionage. The messages identified Liberal as an active Soviet agent who had recruited and coordinated a network of sources. Additionally, documents from Soviet archives that became accessible after the collapse of the Soviet Union corroborated Julius's role and provided details about his espionage activities that matched the testimony given at trial. Ethel's role, however, remained more ambiguous. The declassified evidence suggested that she had been aware of Julius's activities and had perhaps provided some support, but there was no clear evidence that she had been an active spy in her own right. This raised troubling questions about whether her prosecution and execution had been justified. Some historians and legal scholars have argued that Ethel was executed primarily as a tactic to pressure Julius to confess and cooperate, and that when that tactic failed, the government proceeded with her execution despite having relatively weak evidence of her direct participation in espionage. In 2001, David Greenglass recanted key elements of his trial testimony. In an interview with journalist Sam Roberts, he admitted that he had lied under oath about Ethel's typing of classified documents, and that he had implicated his sister more deeply than the facts warranted in order to protect his own wife, Ruth, who had also been involved in the espionage conspiracy. Greenglass expressed regret, but also stated that he had felt he had no choice at the time. This recantation lent substantial support to the argument that Ethel had been wrongfully executed based on false testimony. Michael and Robert Meeropol spent decades seeking to clear their mother's name and to obtain acknowledgement from the U.S. government that Ethel had been unjustly executed. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests, pursued legal appeals, and wrote extensively about their parents' case. In recent years, they have received some vindication. In 2021, after years of advocacy, the New York City Board of Aldermen issued a proclamation stating that Ethel Rosenberg had been wrongfully convicted and executed. While this proclamation did not carry legal force and Ethel's conviction has not been formally overturned, it represented a symbolic acknowledgement that she had been treated unjustly. The broader impact of the Rosenberg case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The case intensified Cold War paranoia and contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected American society throughout the 1950s. The case was used by anti-communist politicians to justify aggressive investigations and loyalty programs. It contributed to public support for expanded domestic surveillance and for restrictions on civil liberties in the name of national security. For the intelligence community, the Rosenberg case and the broader revelations from the Venona program led to significant changes in security procedures. The realization that Soviet intelligence had successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project and other sensitive programs prompted a comprehensive review of security clearance processes, background investigations, and counterintelligence operations. The case also highlighted the vulnerability created by individuals with ideological motivations for espionage, a different profile from traditional spies motivated primarily by money or coercion. Julius Rosenberg's actual contribution to Soviet atomic weapons development has been assessed by historians and scientists who have examined both the classified information he passed and the Soviet bomb program's timeline. The consensus is that while the information Greenglass provided about the implosion mechanism was significant, it was not decisive in enabling the Soviets to build their bomb. The Soviet program was staffed by highly competent scientists who would likely have solved the technical problems independently, though perhaps with some delay. Klaus Fuchs, who had far more extensive access to Manhattan Project information than Greenglass, probably provided more valuable intelligence. Nonetheless, the information from Julius Rosenberg's network did give the Soviets confirmation of their own research and potentially saved them time and resources in their weapons development program. Michael and Robert Meeropol grew up in the shadow of their parents' executions. Both eventually attended college, pursued professional careers, and had families of their own. Michael became an economics professor and later the founder of the Rosenberg Fund for Children, an organization that provides support to children of targeted activists. Robert became an attorney. Both remained involved throughout their lives in efforts to rehabilitate their parents' legacy and to oppose what they saw as government persecution of political dissidents. In interviews conducted over the years, both Michael and Robert described the complex and evolving relationship they had with their parents' memory. As children, they had been told by the Meeropols that their parents had been innocent victims of injustice, and they had accepted this narrative. As adults, particularly after the declassification of the Venona documents in Soviet archives, They had to grapple with evidence that their father had indeed committed espionage. Michael acknowledged in his memoir that Julius had been a Soviet agent, though he maintained that his father's motivations had been idealistic rather than mercenary, and that the severity of the punishment had been unjust. Both brothers continued to insist that their mother had been innocent of any substantive involvement and that her execution had been a grave injustice. David Greenglass, who testified against his sister and brother-in-law to save himself and his wife, lived until 2014. He served 10 years in federal prison and then lived quietly under an assumed name. In his later years, he expressed regret about his testimony against Ethel, but maintained that he had felt he had no choice. He described the impossible position he had been in: cooperate and send his sister to her death, or refuse and face the death penalty himself, while also endangering his wife. He chose to save himself and Ruth, and Ethel paid the price. The question of responsibility in the Rosenberg case is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who believed they were acting according to their principles or their understanding of justice. Julius chose to commit espionage for ideological reasons he believed were justified. Ethel chose loyalty to her husband over self-preservation. David Greenglass chose to save himself by betraying his sister. Prosecutors chose to seek death sentences as both punishment and tactical leverage. Judge Kaufman chose to impose them. President Eisenhower chose not to intervene. Each choice contributed to an outcome in which 2 people were executed and 2 young children were orphaned. The systemic factors that enabled the case were equally significant. The Cold War created an environment in which ideological conflicts were treated as existential threats. The Communist Party's relationship with Soviet intelligence created channels for recruitment. The American legal system's response to communist subversion created an atmosphere in which prosecutorial excess and the use of defendants as leverage against each other were tolerated and even encouraged. These systems did not cause individual choices, but they shaped what choices seemed available and what consequences seemed justified. Michael and Robert Rosenberg lost their parents not to accident or illness, but to an execution that was the product of espionage, ideology, prosecution, and Cold War politics. They grew up with the knowledge that their father had committed crimes and with the belief, later supported by evidence, that their mother had been unjustly executed. They spent decades seeking vindication for Ethel and seeking to understand the events that destroyed their family. They were children who loved their parents, who had no knowledge of any espionage activities, and who were traumatized by arrests and executions they did not deserve and could not comprehend. The information Julius Rosenberg passed to Soviet intelligence became obsolete within a decade as technology advanced and as the Cold War eventually ended. The damage to U.S. national security, while real, proved less catastrophic than prosecutors claimed at trial. But the damage to the Rosenberg family was total and permanent. The cost of espionage extends beyond the intelligence compromised or the secrets revealed. It costs families, it costs children their parents, it costs individuals their freedom and their lives, and those costs ripple across generations long after the geopolitical conflicts that motivated the original acts have faded into history. Julius Rosenberg was 35 years old when he was executed for espionage he had committed believing he was serving a cause larger than himself. Ethel Rosenberg was 37 when she was executed based on questionable evidence and coerced testimony that would later be recanted. Michael was 10 and Robert was 7 when they lost both parents to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. And in between the moment Julius chose to commit espionage and the moment the executions ended both their lives, the Rosenbergs lost everything: their freedom, their ability to raise their children, their hope that their choices served something larger than the destruction they caused.